Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and we're back today again talking about Sloterdijk and continuing on with our Spheres trilogy. We're still in Bubbles. We're about midway through, I think, and we'll do Excurses 3 and Excurses 4. By way of just catching up a little bit, since last we spoke, we had my flooding. I tried out the thing on YouTube where you just send a message. So I sent a message about the flooding and said it'd be a couple days at least before I got back down here. Unfortunately, then, my son got sick, and then it was my wife's birthday, and then we had to travel for some surgery and stuff like that. So that time frame expanded. But I'm trying to come here today to do this quickly so that I can get it up. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I've tweaked a little bit with the production. I want to try to take sort of more advantage of the possibilities of YouTube as an aesthetic medium, incorporating more visual elements and stuff like that. So I kind of rearranged my setup here and figured out how to do things slightly differently. You can let me know what you think about it. And I'll make clear, what the changes are right now. Okay, so we're turning to Excursus 3, the egg principle, internalization, and encasement. We're talking about the egg, right? The egg as a symbol of internalization and encasement, as a symbol of sheltering and bursting forth, as a symbol of creation, right? And the egg has, for as long as we can tell, basically, been a kind of central symbol of signifying creation, creative powers, the mystery of creation, and the origin of things, right? The egg is actually sort of critical importance in understanding mythopoetically the reality of creation and of the world. And so, for example, this idea of the world egg, you can trace that back in lots of different mythological systems. Particularly in Indo-European cultures and their mythological systems. And that's the kind of thing we see here. This is what this sort of thing is, right? We have this egg, and it says ex ovo omnia, right? Everything comes from the egg, out of an egg, everything. And you can see in this picture, you have all these different diverse forms of life. And so what's being symbolized here is the egg as the origin, as the starting point for life itself, right? For the emergence of sort of all things. All things come from an egg. And like I said, this is a kind of motif that you can trace back in mythologies to, our earliest mythological understanding of creation and of the world in general. This is from William Harvey's De Generatione Animalium, on the generation of animals. Right, and so the idea is all animals come from an egg, right? From a world egg. The world comes from an egg. I wanted to focus on this one specifically. You can look at a lot of this different stuff on your own. The connection between this sort of signifier of the egg to this sort of long history of mythological conceptualizations of the egg and of creation. But I wanted to focus on this one in particular, this kind of Mesopotamian mythology that you would see in the Enuma Elish and stuff like that. Partially because of its connection to Genesis, because, a lot of people talk about the two of those, Enuma Elish and Genesis in the Bible, in relationship to each other. Obviously, the Bible and Christianity is important to our understanding of sort of modern Western culture. So, this is connected in some sense, and there are sort of deep connections. And what do you have here, right? So in the Enuma Elish, we have the oldest written account of creation mythologically, and what is happening in these sort of earliest, most archaic conceptualizations of the creative process, right, of the birth of the universe. What do we have? Front and center, a sphere, and not just a sphere, but an egg, right? An origin. And so what we have is all this wavy stuff is supposed to be, I think it's later called Tiamat. It represents chaos, disorder, the deep, right, in sort of the biblical understanding. And you have at some moment in the creation myth the emergence, the creation of an egg. And inside of the egg is all of life, right? Just like we saw in the William Harvey piece. All of life comes from an egg. And actually in the biblical story, it says the Spirit brooded over the deep. And in Hebrew, the word that's being used there for brooded is specifically the word that they use to talk about hens brooding over their eggs. And so what do we have here in Genesis? We have an account of God brooding over the world egg that he's created, right? And so yeah, we still have this sort of world egg theme and thesis of origins. I also wanted to point out that the sort of modern scientific mythological understanding of the origin of the universe is also a kind of egg story. How so? Well, if you think about the Big Bang, what is the Big Bang? If you go back to the furthest possible point in history, time and space both collapse to a point, and all matter, all energy, everything that constitutes the universe, all of the stuff that makes up the universe, is contained within this kind of single infinitesimal point, which is the starting point of the universe. Then you have this moment of the Big Bang in which everything breaks out, right? The Big Bang is everything that's encapsulated into an egg that's being sheltered within the egg, bursting forth from the egg, right? It's again this kind of scene of an egg. We might as well be talking about this, except instead of these sort of fully formed animals coming out, it's neutrinos or whatever. It's quantum particles or something, and then they bounce and hit each other and accrete and whatever. But ultimately, it's the same sort of account, right? So this understanding and the centrality of the egg in our sort of mythopoetics, in our self-understanding, in our understanding of the universe, this is perennial. And so Sloterdijk wants to focus on it here. He wants to think about the egg and the centrality of the egg. And he wants to think of it, obviously, in these sort of spherological terms. The egg is the kind of primordial sphere, right? The sphere of spheres, the sphere of all life, right? The sphere of origins, of the origins of all things. And so he has this kind of excursus, which is a meditation on the nature of the egg. And so he says a number of things about it that are interesting. One is that he wants to talk about it in terms of the boundary principle, right? That the egg differentiates between inside and outside. And it differentiates between inside and outside in a way wherein the shell of the egg is actually a kind of media of transmission, right? Of communication between the external and the internal. And interestingly, in this sort of most primordial version of the sphere, of the bubble, which is the egg, right? I think you have kind of maximal blockage, right? It's still semi-permeable, but it's a kind of maximum blockage of the external world. And so what gets communicated internally is things like temperature, moisture is pulled in, information about humidity, etc., right? Things like that are transmitted. So with the egg, what you have is the endogenesis is primary. That's what's central to the concept of the egg, and to the sort of life cycle of an egg. What matters is what's inside of it and the development of what's inside of it. And so it takes priority over the external world. But the external world and its development requires not the total rejection of external stimuli, but the filtering out of communications that would be dangerous, that could cause a rupture, things like that, right? And so enough is communicated in just to facilitate the development of life within the egg. But eventually the development of life gets to a point where it emerges, where it spontaneously breaks out of the egg. And so he sees the egg as also kind of symbolizing these two different moments or two different actions of sheltering and bursting forth. If the egg only sheltered, only was caretaking, only a container, then it wouldn't really be an egg. It would be a kind of container, right? It would be an oblong spherical box or whatever you want to say. It would be something like that. But the concept of the egg is not just that it contains something within it, but that there's movement and action and dynamism, and eventually the thing within it is going to break out. And the function of the egg is to protect and help to facilitate the development of what's inside so that the egg bursts out. So the egg, as a concept and as a symbol, contains both this kind of function of sheltering and this function of destruction from inside, from inside out. It's both of those things simultaneously, a kind of self-liberation and protection. And it comes about through sort of maternal power, which is important because he's going to wind up saying that, we've already seen somewhat that the mother and the fetus and then the child form a kind of spherical model of themselves. He also wants to say, the idea of the egg as an origin, right? What is an origin? An origin has to sort of bear an imprint on what it's the origin of, or it wouldn't be the origin. In other words, let's think if you create a thing, but then it doesn't come forth from you, right? It stays inherent, then it's not an origin, right? It's a static moment or something like that. If you have something that breaks out and differentiates itself, then that thing was the origin of whatever is differentiated. But if it doesn't continue to have some kind of relationship to it, some kind of effect on it, then it wouldn't be an origin, right? Origins are important. The kind of genetic methodology is important because whatever the origin point is continues to impress upon in some way whatever comes after. And so that's how he thinks about the egg, right? It's this primordial morphological form, which has been so important to us in terms of our self-understanding, our cosmic understanding. And it's important to us in terms of our individual life cycles. And he wants to say basically that the psychohistorical development of human beings, of development as subjectivities, is also, it also has the same movement spherologically of spheropoiesis. You're in an egg, you get an egg, and then there's a sufficient amount of development that you need more internalization. You need more information, more input, communication coming from the outside. So there's a rupture of the shell, of this sort of membrane boundary, and a recreation, right? A new spheropoiesis. And so he thinks of the psychohistorical development of human beings like this. Like you're in the womb, you burst out. Then you're in the uterus, and then you burst out. And then you're in the birth canal, and you burst out. And then you're in this sphere of fetus and mother. And then somehow there's a trauma to that. And you could think about Lacan or anything like that. Like the presence of the father complicates this and triangulates this picture. So again, that would be, there's a rupture of the sphere in which you have the mother and the child, this bipolarity. It's broken. Now you have the family unit or whatever, and then it's broken and you have the house and blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of this macro-historical picture he's going to give us throughout the Spheres trilogy, but it starts with bubbles, right? Is there anything else I needed to say about that? He points out, obviously, that what's interior to the shell, to the egg, is what's most important, right? Its development is what's important. You put it in different milieus, and there's still this kind of filtering process in order to protect and to nourish the development of what's inside, right? Until a different or a greater milieu can sort of be incorporated, right? And so you can scale up in terms of your egg spheres. He wants to highlight the importance of the fact that in human beings, the egg gets internalized. And so you have inward ovulation, right? The egg is internal to the woman. And he talks about this in terms of like turtles emerging from the beach, from the sand, and how people used to be like, oh, you have this kind of egg of the earth, and coming from the earth itself, you get the emergence of these life forms. So the earth was understood its crust as a kind of shell of a giant egg, right? And so you have this like crazy mythic drama of just life emerging from the earth itself. And he says that the inward ovulation of human beings makes this kind of the picture for human beings too, where you don't have an egg and then the egg is broken and a human being pops out of it. You have a human being, and then like in the movie Alien, you get this eruption from within that breaks through the organism of the mother, and then you have another human being. I think this also enables, he doesn't really talk about it here, but like neoteny, right? The juvenilization of human beings, that we're born more immature. I think this is also a product of this kind of inward ovulation, the internal development of the organism within an internal egg. And then, he's like, so we have an ontical change of place. This is going to become more important as we go on, but you have an ontical change of location for the organism of the human, which is developed in this inward egg. Now it's outward after birth, right? So ontically, and this is Heidegger's language, you have a change of location, but it has ontological significance. And the ontological significance of that, we're going to get more into. But, we'll get into that later. But so he wants to say there's sort of 4 different shells. Like a triple shell rupture is what you see in the birth of a baby. You have the shell rupture of the amniotic sac, and the amniotic sac is like the eggshell. Right? That's what separates mother from fetus. That's what allows you to have a kind of different organism. It ensures the separateness of mother and fetus. And then after that, you have the uterus as a shell, right? More is able to be input. You're able to receive more inputs in this sort of greater shell. Then the birth canal, more inputs. Then that shell, the third shell, ruptures, and you're in the external world, which is in which you have a 4th spherical, non-material kind of shell or sphere, which is the infant and the mother, right? And one of the things that he thinks that he points out that I think is very interesting to me here is that he thinks of psychopathology in these kind of morphological, spherological, spatial terms as a kind of premature rupture of this 4th shell. So if you think about an egg, you have a chicken egg or whatever. If you break that egg before inward development is sufficient that it brings itself out, or could, then you stop the process of development and it dies, right? There's a retardation of the development of the organism within the shell. He thinks this is also true, but the death is psychological rather than existential when you're talking about a premature kind of rupture of this 4th spherical shell, right? This 4th spherical egg, right? And you can think about this in terms of like Freud and Lacan, right? If there are problems in terms of the differentiation of the child from the mother, in terms of this, sort of primary bipolarity, then you wind up with something like psychosis, right? Psychopathology emerges in terms of some kind of damage, some kind of spheric catastrophe, he says, in terms of shell transfer from a lower to a higher sort of order of shell when you're thinking about the 4th shell. And so he also wants to say, sort of presages things he's going to talk about later in terms of this being crucial to an understanding of modernity and modernization, right? That a theory of modernization would only be credible and useful if understood as a transcript of ontological process psychosis, right? He wants to understand this on a sort of civilizational, historical scale in which you have process psychosis ontologically, i.e. spheric catastrophe that results in a kind of social psychopathology. He wants to understand things like that. Okay, so then we'll... Oh, this is he finishes off this chapter by saying, as the age of the systematic shifting of boundaries, collective husk pathologies, and epidemic shell disturbances, the current epoch calls for a historical anthropology of processive madness. And so, again, that's sort of what he's going to wind up trying to give us in this spherological, macrohistorical account. Right. So then we move on to Excurses 4. In Dasein, there lies an essential tendency towards closeness, Heidegger's doctrine of existential space. And he begins this chapter by talking about how being in time was supposed to have the follow-up of a kind of being in space. And there was supposed to be, Heidegger was supposed to give a really systematic sort of analysis of existential place. And again, if you are interested in philosophy theory at all, you're going to hear this sort of contrast between place, which is supposed to be sort of existential, and space, which is supposed to be sort of de-worlded and non-subjective or something like that. You're going to hear this kind of contrast made a lot. And yeah, I think, as far as I understand, it has its origins in Heidegger. But yeah, he says that people tend to overlook this fact that being in time was supposed to have this sequel of sort of being in space, and he thinks that being in time is ultimately rooted in being in space, in the sort of existential analytics of movement that he thought Heidegger was supposed to follow up being in time with. And you can see he thinks some sort of gestures in that direction in being in time. But he says that Heidegger's analytics of existential spatiality arrive at a positive tracing of Dasein's spatiality as approach and orientation, basically through destruction, right? He wants to destroy our kind of vulgar physics and a vulgar metaphysics in terms of our understanding of man in terms of being in space. We need to reject the kind of vulgar physics of containers, and we need to reject the kind of vulgar metaphysics of what he's later going to call sort of like utero-technical metaphysical projects in which we try to understand sort of the cosmos as a giant womb or a God that we're within, in which God is immanent and everything all around us. He's saying Heidegger wants to reject sort of both of these things. In Heidegger, you have this phrase, being in the world, in der Weltsein, right? And that's sort of crucial for Heidegger. It's existential. And he says, Heidegger is at pains to make clear in being in time that by that he doesn't mean like a container and then an object located within a container. That the being in the world of man is fundamentally ontologically different than that. And we get more insight into that kind of phenomenon when we think about it in terms of things like dwelling or habitation, being alongside mid-sign. So he thinks that we need to be thinking about an existential analysis of spatiality or place, right, in which we're not inside in a verbal transitive sense, that in fact we're living in it, in the world, and benefiting from it already, having been explored in prior acts of attunement and reaching out. He says, existence is always a completed act of habitation, the result of a primal leap into inhabitation, which is to say, at every moment in which you're existing, which for Heidegger this word is important, exist, standing outside, that's standing outside of our sphere in some sense. But existence is always a completed act of habitation, which is to say, we've already made ourselves at home in the world. Right? And you can see this again in terms of this egg metaphor, right? You have this sort of domesticity of the interior of the egg, and at every moment, like you have a home, right? There's external information that's being kept out. You might bring some of it in. You bring some of it in to be a part of your world in which you're, at home, in which you have this sort of primal inhabitation, right? And he goes on to say, we need to reject totally the idea that we have sort of domesticity within this gigantic world, and that's what existence is. And he says, the possibility of being at home in the world is precisely what we're questioning, as to its possibility, as to its meaning. And so to presuppose it would be to relapse into a kind of physics of containers that we're trying to overcome. And then he said, of course, incidentally, this is the primal error of reasoning that is found in all holistic worldviews and doctrines of uterine immanence, and hardens invariably into pious half-thoughts. And he says, the reality of our situation is the structure is more like a ball of care in which existence has spread out in an original being outside of itself. That's this ekstasis, right? So our concernful engagement with things in the world is a kind of, spreading out beyond our domesticity, right? Beyond our place, our existential situation or something like that. And through our concern, we integrate things. And so he says, Heidegger's radical phenomenological attentiveness removes the foundation of a multimillennial rule of container physics and metaphysics. Man is neither a living being in the world around him, nor a rational being in the firmament, nor a perceiving being inside of God. And so he says environmentalism and biology both make this mistake. Nowadays, there's much talk about man's having an environment, Heidegger points out, but then he says, we learn nothing of this. It says nothing ontologically as long as this having an environment is left indefinite. It's the relationship between us and the environment that we have that we really need to inquire about, right? That we need to understand. Man isn't a being himself, isolated, and then has a world as some extra, right? We have a world existentially. It's a part of who we wouldn't have us if we didn't have the world, right? And that again, you can think about it in terms of this sort of egg phenomenon, right? He doesn't sometimes provide himself with a world. He takes up relationships to it, and only because he's always already in the world, right? You have to be in it in order to take up a relationship to it. A present-at-hand object, and this is, I should probably do a video on Heidegger, but so he has this dichotomy of present-at-hand and ready-to-hand. Present-at-hand is like an object with properties that's analyzable. It's a set of things that you could say something about propositionally, right? It's like the object of science or rational reflection or something like that. Whereas the ready-to-hand is things in, he says, our environment, our Umwelt, that we're just interacting with, engaging with, using, right? And so he says a present-at-hand object, a thing with properties, doesn't show itself outside of us and then meet up with us, right? We can only meet up in the first place because it shows itself within the world already, right? Or you could think about it in terms of only because it's ready to hand within the world, within our environment, it's intelligible to us as part of our world, could we then abstract out and think about its properties and things like that. And so then he wants to talk about Cartesianism. In Descartes, of course, there are two substances, res cogitans and res extensa. That is to say, extended things and thinking things, and these are the two sort of substances. And so this is Cartesian dualism. And so he says that, Descartes is reluctant to question where res cogitans and res extensa can meet up. And this is the problem of interactionism. People talk about this a lot. The idea is, if you have a substance which is non-material and a substance which is material, how do they come into contact with each other? How do they affect each other? How can an idea affect the material universe if they're totally distinct substances, right? And Heidegger is saying, Descartes' reluctant to consider where they could possibly meet up. The problem can't occur to him because for Descartes, only bodies and things possess extension, as in not us, not res cogitans, not cognition. For Descartes, cogitans is a kind of worldless authority that can strangely choose to submit to the whims of extended things or submit it to its whims. It's like a kind of ghostly hunter that forays into the realm of the extended and then withdraws again into the worldless fortress of his extensionless domain. And Heidegger and Sloterdijk both want to say that this is very wrong, right? Because spatiality is grounded in place, right? Something can only be an extended thing with properties of mass and things like that if it's already part of our world, right? We've already sort of reached out into the abyss, into Tiamat, into the disordered, and we've brought it into the interior of our ordered domain, our world, our sphere, which is intelligible to us. And he says, Heidegger, his phenomenology of space features two things majorly: deseverance and directionality, and that's what I'm talking about. Deseverance is it makes things that are far disappear, right, in their farness. Their remoteness disappears. It brings it right up close to us, right? So it's foreign, alien, strange. If you think about the egg, right, this is the permeability that brings in, that accepts, right? It takes what's far away, what's truly external, and it internalizes it and encases it, right? Dasein, he says, is essentially disseverant. That's what we're doing all the time. Consciousness, you could say, in some sense, has this orientation of desevering. We're constantly apprehending, internalizing, bringing into our world. As such, we have this other property, which is directionality, he says, right? That, which is to say, we're always out there somewhere, returning into our sphere. We're always, in some sense, outside of ourselves, outside of our world. That's how we can abstract. That's how we can assimilate new information, right? If you weren't like this, you would be psychotic. You would be severely autistic or something like that, not acquire language. You would just have a sort of permanent world that's unchanging. But since we're always directed in a particular way, bringing things in, right? That's what we're always doing, reaching out and bringing things into our world. Because we're like that, we're human beings, right? And he says circumspective concern, which is what we're doing, right? That's this ball of care we were talking about, is desevering, which gives directionality. And he says when we let things be encountered, when we encounter things, we talk about this in terms of we're making room for it, we give it space. This is existential. Dasein, consequently, the subject of the human being, if understood ontologically correctly, is really spatial. In all of our encounters with things in our existence, in our day-to-day lives, what we're doing is always this sort of spatializing activity of, reaching out to our sphere, pulling things in it, formalizing the world, developing our interior, having these kind of ruptures, etc., right? And so sometime in this process, you could have a spherical catastrophe, or you could continue to develop, mature, subjectivate, whatever. And he says, unfortunately, this isn't the project that followed Heidegger's overtures. He switched from where to who, and only just began unraveling the thread, which, if unwound, would have opened up something like the multi-significant universes of existential spaciousness that Sloterdijk is addressing here under the catchword spheres. So basically, if Heidegger had proceeded in this direction, Sloterdijk is saying he would have produced something like spheres. And he wants to say that this spatiality of human beings, inhabitation in spheres, isn't possible to explicate, is unintelligible so far as existence is understood primarily in terms of a supposedly natural inclination to loneliness. that's a wrong-headed way of going about trying to understand human beings and the nature of his inhabitation. We need to understand it as fundamentally, like we've been talking about, kind of consisting in bipolarities, in terms of, he says, deep structures of accompanied and augmented existence. At the deepest, most fundamental level, and historical primordially, right, in sort of this mythical, spherical, poetical domain, you have at the foundation something like the egg, right, which is combines a kind of maternal power, self-liberation, internal and external, things being internalized and encased, etc. So it's this whole sort of dynamic process. So yeah, that's Excurses 3 and 4. Hopefully that was okay. Hopefully you've got something out of this new super sophisticated production technique that I'm engaged in here. I'll see you next time. Don't simply think. Wait, remember not to simply think, but or don't simply react, but think culture. Where's my button here? Oh, I need to come way over here, right? Sorry, guys. One sec. Don't simply react, but think culture.